Today my discussion is a continuation of the previous video with regard to the thalamic nuclei. The last video, Thalamus part 4, discussed about the 5 out of the many nuclei related to the thalamus, and so today I'm going to discuss the 6th nucleus of the thalamus. So if you can remember, I said that thalamus is an egg-shaped structure. If you now take a cross-section, horizontal section of the thalamus, you are going to see that thalamus is divided into 3 parts by a white matter bundles of axons forming the nuclei within it. That white matter is Y-shaped structure known as intramedullary lamina. And so it divides the thalamus into anterior part, medial part, and lateral part. And so even the lateral portion of the thalamus is further subdivided into ventral part and dorsal part or posterior part. And so there are nuclei in each of these group. In the anterior group you have, in the anterior part of the thalamus we have anterior thalamic nucleus. On the medial side we have dorsomedial nucleus, and on the lateral side we have about 5 nuclei. We have one important nucleus that is located inside the intramedullary lamina. And by the side of the thalamus we have 2 bodies, one on the medial side and the other one on the lateral side. These are the geniculate bodies. The medial geniculate body receives information with regard to the hearing, while the lateral geniculate body receives visual stimulus from the eye or from the retina itself. So, as I said, I've already discussed 5 nuclei of the thalamus. If you can remember, I made mention that thalamus has 3 major functions. The first one is the sensory function, second one, motor function, and the third one is limbic function. So all these nuclei of the thalamus, their own function center towards these 3 major functions that I've made mention. So I discussed the anterior thalamic nucleus, dorsomedial or mediodorsal thalamic nucleus. These 2 are together with the centromedian nucleus of the thalamus. They are all responsible for the limbic function of the thalamus. So the remaining, nuclei, they are responsible for sensory and motor functions. So today I'm going to discuss sensory and motor functions of the thalamic nuclei. So the 6th nucleus that I'm going to discuss today, since I have discussed 5 before, is what is called or known as Pulvinar nucleus. And this Pulvinar nucleus, if you can remember inter alia, I said that it is part of the lateral group of nuclei of the thalamus, and so it is at the posterior part of the lateral group of the thalamic nucleus. So this Pulvinar receive auditory information from the medial genicular body, also receive visual information from the lateral genicular body. So it has 2 inputs from these 2 bodies. Similarly, the Pulvinar receive information with regard to the auditory stimulus and visual stimulus from the corpora quadragemina at the back of the midbrain. If you can remember, I said that at the back of the midbrain there are 4 swellings, 2 above and 2 below. Those one above are known as superior colliculi, and those below are known as inferior colliculi. So auditory information or auditory stimulus, coming from the internal ear reaches, the inferior colliculi. From there, information passes upward for that audition into the Pulvinar. Similarly, visual stimulus or visual information from the retina also reaches the superior colliculi, and from the superior colliculi, that visual information reaches the Pulvinar. So you can see that the Pulvinar receives 4 inputs. One from the medial genicular body, the other one from the lateral genicular body, and the third one is from the inferior colliculi, the fourth one is from the superior colliculi. So you see the informations with regard to the vision or audition, these informations are, taken to two different places. So information with regard to the visual stimulus that reaches the pulvinar from the superior colliculi, it now goes into the visual cortex, area 18 and 19, for processing, for analysis and recognition of that visual information. While auditory information coming from the inferior colliculi and also from the medial genicular body into the pulvinar, that auditory information now reaches the temporal lobe. That is the auditory area 41 and 42 for analysis and recognition of that information. So you can see that the major functions of this, output from the inferior colliculi and superior colliculi is for the reflex head movement with regard to the visual stimulus or with regard to the auditory stimulus. And that is the major function of this, connection between the superior and inferior colliculi with the pulvinar and from the pulvinar with the visual cortex or with the auditory cortex. That is, the pulvinar nucleus. So the next nucleus is the nucleus known as ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. This ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus is responsible for carrying sensory information from the lower limbs, upper limbs, pelvis and perineum, as well as abdomen and trunk from our own skin. So this sensory information is for pain, temperature, crude touch, and pressure. So together with fine touch and discrimination touch, as well as vibration. All this information from our lower limbs and from our upper limb, from the trunk in general, the information is now being taken to the ventral posterolateral nucleus, while the sensory information with regard to this information that I've just made mention from the head and the neck, this information now, is taken to the ventral posteromedial nucleus. So that means the human body is represented like this. So you have the head and the neck here, and then here you have the trunk, here, and the limbs. So here you have the trunk, all this information with regard to the pain, temperature, crude touch and pressure, fine touch and discrimination sense, and vibration sense, proprioception and other things like that. They reach, the ventral posterolateral nucleus, while this kind of sensation from the head and the neck reaches the information with regard to these sensations, reaches the ventral posteromedial nucleus. So what happens is that the information from our skin with regard to the pain, temperature, crude touch, and pressure, this information is being carried through the spinal nerves into the posterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. From there, second order neuron, passes, out of the gray matter into the anterior column of the spinal cord, and then it ascends up at the anterior, spinothalamic tract, because finally these fibers now reach the thalamus, that is the ventral posterolateral nucleus. Similarly, part of this, sensation, pain, temperature, crude touch, and pressure, now deviates from the anterior side into the lateral side, and that is what is known as lateral spinothalamic tract that passes upward. The two tracts, that is both anterior and lateral spinothalamic tract, they unite together to form the spinothalamic tract, which finally emanates or continues at the spinal lemniscus. So the pain and temperature sensation is being carried by the lateral spinothalamic tract, while crude touch and pressure is being carried by the anterior spinothalamic tract. So the two tracts now, they ascend up, one from within the anterior white column of the spinal cord, the other one, the lateral spinothalamic tract, lies in the lateral white column of the spinal cord, and the two tracts now ascend up to form a single tract, that is the spinal lemniscus, which finally now reaches the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. And from there, now this information with regard to the sensation have been carried into the primary somatosensory cortex or area, for processing of those informations. Similarly, information with regard to the fine touch, discrimination sense, and discrimination touch and vibration sense, as well as the perception position of the muscles, tendons, and joints, all this information or sensations have been taken through the spinal nerve fibers. So it enters the nerve fibers. As they enter into the posterior horn of the gray matter, they get out of the posterior horn without making any synapse, and then they go into the posterior white column of the spinal cord, where they ascend up as, fasciculi. So these fasciculi are divided into two parts, one on the medial side, the other one on the lateral side. The one on the medial side is called gracile fasciculus. The other one on the lateral side is called cuneate fasciculus. So here we have our medial fasciculus known as the gracile fasciculus, and this one is the lateral fasciculus known as the cuneate fasciculus. So the two fasciculi, as they ascend up, they reach the level of the medulla oblongata, where they now synapse the first order neuron now synapses with the second order neuron within two nuclei. The one on the medial side and the other one on the lateral side. The one on the medial side is called gracile nucleus, while the other one on the lateral side is called cuneate nucleus. So from this nuclei, second order neuron now ascend up to form what we call medial lemniscus. And so this medial lemniscus, it now reaches the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus, carrying this fine touch, discrimination touch, and vibration sense, plus the proprioception from our muscles, tendons, joints, and so on and so forth. So they now ascend up through that dorsal column, from the dorsal column into the medulla oblongata. From there, the second order neuron, axons there, they form the medial lemniscus, and so the medial lemniscus ascends and then until it reaches the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. So this is called dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. And so that is for the ventral posterolateral nucleus function, carrying this sensory information for the lower limbs, upper limb, and trunks with regard to this type of sensation. The next nucleus is the ventral posteromedial nucleus. This ventral posteromedial nucleus is similar in function to the ventral posterolateral nucleus in that this nucleus now receives sensory information with regard to the pain, temperature, crude touch, and pressure, fine touch, discrimination touch, as well as vibration, together with proprioception. But this time around, this sensation have been carried from the head and the neck. So through one cranial nerve known as trigeminal nerve, that is the fifth cranial nerve. So this sensation from the face and the head, from the head and neck, have been carried through the trigeminal nerve. So the trigeminal nerve now, the first order neuron, they reach the three group of nuclei of the trigeminal nerve that are located within the brainstem. So in the brainstem, there are three group of nuclei for the trigeminal nerve. One in the middle brain, known as mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The other one is in the pons, known as principal pontine nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The other one is within the spinal cord and part of the medulla oblongata. That is the spinal component or spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So the trigeminal nerve fibers carrying these informations from the head and the neck. These fibers of the trigeminal nerve reach its own three nuclei. From there, efferent fibers, they combine together to form trigeminothalamic tract, because as a result, this tract now enters into the ventral posteromedial thalamic nucleus, and then finally, information is now taken, to the primary somatosensory area, where the face is located at the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. So again, apart from carrying this information for pain, temperature, and other sensations like that, taste sensation is also being carried to the ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. This taste sensation is being carried from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue via the seventh cranial nerve, that is the facial nerve. Similarly, taste sensation from the posterior one-third of the tongue is being carried through the glossopharyngeal nerve, that is the ninth cranial nerve. Again, taste sensation around the epiglottis, around the posterior part of the pharynx, and around the area, just between the posterior one-third of the tongue and the epiglottis. All those taste sensations have been taken through the 10th cranial nerve, that is the vagus nerve. So you can see that taste sensation is being carried through three different cranial nerves: the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerve. So the information from this taste sensation from these three different areas has been taken into one nucleus that is found in the medulla oblongata, that is the nucleus of the tractus solitarius. And this nucleus of tractus solitarius, from there, second order neuron from this nucleus now ascend up, as what is known as central tegmental tract, and then it finally reaches the ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus, and from there this taste sensation has been taken to the gustatory area or taste area that is located at the inferior part of the primary somatosensory area, that is an area around the insular part of the cerebral cortex. And so that is, by and large, the major function of the ventral posteromedial nucleus. Taste sensation and sensation with regard to the pain, temperature, crude touch, pressure, fine touch, vibration, and so on and so forth from the head and the neck. The next nucleus is the ventral anterior nucleus. And this ventral anterior nucleus, together with the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus, these two nuclei are responsible for the motor movement of our own body. That is, they are responsible for the planning and initiation of our motor movement. So if you can remember, I already said that the thalamus has three different functions. Limbic functions to do with the anterior thalamic nucleus, dorsomedial and centromedial nucleus. Sensory functions is to do with the medial genicular body, lateral genicular body, pulvinar, ventral posterior lateral nucleus, and ventral posteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. So these five nuclei of the thalamus are responsible for the sensory function of the thalamus, while these three are responsible for the limbic function of the thalamus. The remaining two, that is ventral anterior and ventrolateral nuclei of the thalamus, are for the motor function of the thalamus. So if we look at the ventral anterior nucleus of the thalamus, information regarding planning and starting a particular movement. For example, somebody that wants to move, he or she must start by making a step. So that planning to move, there has to be followed. It has to be followed by starting the movement. So planning and starting the movement comes from the premotor cortex, that is area number 6 of the cerebral cortex. From there, the information to plan and initiate motor movement passes through the basal nuclei. Part of the basal nuclei that this information passes is through the caudate nucleus. From the caudate nucleus, the information for that planning and initiation goes into the putamen of the basal nucleus, and also from there, second order neuron now goes into the globus pallidus interna. From there, now third order neuron now reaches the ventral anterior nucleus of the thalamus. From there, now the fourth order neuron now reaches the motor cortex. So the basal nucleus or the basal nuclei, fine tune, the already planned and initiation of movement, so that finally the actual, ways of, amplifying and, modifying the movement now reaches the motor cortex. Similarly, some of the, fibers from the premotor cortex, and they pass through the caudate nucleus and the putamen of the basal nucleus. The second order neuron from this putamen goes into the globus pallidus externa, and then from there, third order neuron goes into the globus pallidus interna, and from the globus pallidus interna, the fourth order neuron now reaches the subthalamic nucleus, and from there, from the subthalamic nucleus now, fifth order neuron now reaches the globus pallidus interna, and from there now the sixth order neuron now reaches the ventral anterior nucleus of the thalamus before it finally now reaches the motor cortex. So both these pathways, the first one is called direct pathway. That means from the premotor cortex through the caudate nucleus to the putamen, from the putamen to the globus pallidus interna, from the globus pallidus interna to the ventral anterior nucleus, then from there to the motor cortex. That is what is called direct pathway. Another pathway, that is the indirect pathway, from the premotor cortex for the initiation and planning and initiation of the motor movement to the caudate nucleus, to the globus pallidus, and then to the globus pallidus externa, from the globus pallidus externa to the globus pallidus interna, then from there to the substantia nigra, and then from the subthalamic nucleus, from the subthalamic nucleus now back into the globus pallidus interna, and then from there now information, regarding, the dampening of this motor movement reaches the ventral anterior nucleus before it finally now reaches the motor cortex. So this is the indirect pathway. So both direct and indirect pathway, these two pathways are responsible for planning and initiation of motor movement. The direct pathway is responsible for amplification of the already planned motor movement, while the indirect pathway is responsible for the, dampening of the, already amplified motor movement from the direct pathway. And so the substantia nigra that is present in the midbrain, that one also contributes to the modification of this already planned motor movement from the premotor cortex. So some axons from the substantia nigra, they reach the putamen so as to, modify the already amplified and already dampened, already planned motor movement, so that finally the substantia nigra connection modifies this already planned, motor movement, and then finally you have a smooth or fine movement that one intends to do. So that is, the ventral anterior nucleus of the thalamus. The last one is the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus. This ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus is just directly behind and lateral to the ventral anterior nucleus of the thalamus. The major function of this nucleus is, number one, to coordinate. Second one, to regulate our already planned motor movement, as well as, modification of that movement. So just similar to the ventral anterior nucleus, fibers, the information for planning and initiation of motor movement from the premotor cortex reaches the basal nuclei. From the basal nuclei now, it now reaches the ventrolateral nucleus. From there, it now goes to, the information now goes to the motor cortex, so as the final, movement that is, going to be performed is going to be coordinated by this connection. And then again, information still from the premotor area of the cerebral cortex, it also dropped down, to the cerebellum, because we are all aware that cerebellum is also responsible for coordination of our already planned motor movement, as well as maintaining the muscle tone, maintaining the body posture, as well as balance of our own body. So from the cerebellum, this information of the already planned motor movement from the premotor area, now as it comes into the cerebellum is now going to update, the cerebral cortex about the positions of our muscles in space, the type, the kind of tone in our muscles, and also the posture we are in, the positions of our joints, and what have you. All this information, cerebellum is now going to update, the cerebral cortex, and also going to calculate the error of the already planned movement, as well as the situation at which our own body is. So the cerebellum now finally gives an actual or appropriate kind of movement that is going to be performed, by our own body. So finally, that is the actual or major functions of all these, thalamic nuclei. So thank you very much for watching. And next time I'm going to discuss something, about other part of the, central nervous system.